Hello.
Hello.
John, sorry for interrupting you, but you're muted. Darn it. I could lip sync if that helps.
I think John's saying that Penguin has just been released. Is that what you're saying, John?
I can't hear anything either, just to confirm.
Hey everyone, welcome to today's Google Webmaster Central. Let's do hangout. Probably not come back.
Hi. Yes? No?
Yes.
Yep, definitely.
Woohoo! All right. Thanks for the introduction, Mihai. Welcome to today's Hangout. My name is John. I'm a Webmaster Trends Analyst here at Google in Switzerland. And part of what I do when the audio works is do these Hangouts with publishers and webmasters. As always, if any of you have anything on your mind, any questions that you'd like to start off with, feel free to jump on in now.
I would like to jump in if I can.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm Alana. I work in communications and PR, so SEO is not entirely my remit, and more so it's certainly not my area of expertise. But John, I was hoping to get your thoughts here on something I want to bring your attention to regarding a few websites in the US and also one in the UK here, and just some of the activities I've seen around the rankings and the navigation of these pages. So I'm going to share my screen, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, just so I can show you here what I've noticed. Let me know when you can see it.
I can see myself. Okay.
So first I'll go here. So I'm going to show you EasyBib. I've got BibMe, Citation Machine, and then Cite This For Me. And so they're all a Chegg service. You can see right here, this one here, Chegg service. I'll go back here. Citation Machine is also owned by Chegg. BibMe.org, Chegg, and then finally EasyBib is also a Chegg service. So we can see here they're all owned by the same parent company. And they all essentially have very similar, if not almost mirrored, navigation. So I see here when I go to like the essay tools, for example, you've got a plagiarism checker, and then we've also got citation guides. That's pretty much replicated here with plagiarism checker and a citation guide. Citation Machine, once it loads up, also plagiarism checker. So you see where I'm going here with those three sites, sort of looking the exact same in terms of navigation, and they're clearly owned by the same company, Chegg. And the reason I sort of bring that up is actually because when the search rankings come up, when I look here, say at Citation Machine, so that comes up there with, I've got EasyBib, BibMe, we've got Citation Machine. So clearly there's a monopoly going on here. You know, they're essentially the same tool operating in the same space with the same audience. I'll show you another sort of search, the way they're ranking here. MLA formatter, we've also got EasyBib, Citation Machine coming up, bibme.org. So again, I suppose sort of my thoughts and my issues with that is just, is this the best user journey? Considering it's essentially the same tool and reaching the same audience. They rank in really great positions, but there's really no differentiation in the product. So that's sort of one issue I want to concern. And the second one actually has to do with their fourth site, which is a UK site. Cite this for me, also a Chegg service here. And there's something, I'm going to show you this tab. This is interesting to me, as I'm not particularly sure about the Google guidelines or what's sort of allowed here, but they've got a message that pops up if you'd like to link to us. They will grant you a subscription value of £250. You see here it's stated, and so that's essentially for domains ending in .edu or any sort of academic institution. Obviously, that's their target market and target audience. So I'm not sure if that's exactly ethical according to the guidelines. I'm sort of learning the SEO remit now. I'm quite early in my exploration of this, but then the resources page further on Cite This For Me, they've got a few options here. One's adding links. So they're definitely trying to build some links here. And another issue with this I would see is that there's just a lot of keyword pushing here, so Harvard referencing. When I saw this, I thought, okay, the rankings must be quite high here. So I show you the Harvard rankings for their page. Again, there's Cite This For Me, the top two here. So I would say that that's certainly a result of them, building links or selling links or offering a paid subscription with this sort of add us to your site. I'd also want to bring your attention to the mobile site. I mean, you can look at this on your own time, but their mobile site is actually a really poor user experience. When I found this, actually it was on mobile. And yeah, bring that up if you have time later on today or whatnot on your mobile, because it's a really disappointing user journey, and it ranks the top one we see here for Harvard referencing. So so those are two issues I sort of wanted to bring to your attention. Love to get your thoughts. I'd love to get other people's thoughts on what you think about this. I'd appreciate any information or any details, again, around sort of the guidelines or how this all works. This is my first time in this Hangout, so I do appreciate your time, and I appreciate you letting me share that with you.
All right, thanks a lot. So I'll have to look at those details afterwards when I have a bit more time and kind of double check with the teams involved there to see if that's really working as expected or not. In general, it's not the case that we'd say you should only have like one result in the search results for any given query. So that's something where the search quality team likes to have a little bit of room and say, well, sometimes it makes sense to show multiple results from the same site or from the same company for a specific search result. But in this case, it looks, I don't know, at first glance, it looks a little bit like something where we could do a better job of picking this up properly and showing that in the search results. But again, I really need to look at that with the team. In general, with these types of things, I'd probably recommend posting in the Webmaster Help Forum or sending me a note on Google Plus with the details that you've run across, so that we can kind of look into what actually is happening there. One thing to kind of keep in mind is that sometimes you'll see sites doing kind of shady things or that look kind of weird at first glance, but our algorithms are already kind of taking that into account and discounting a lot of that shady stuff. So just because they're doing it and still visible in search somewhere doesn't necessarily mean that they're profiting from this kind of, I don't know, I haven't looked at the details here, but potentially shady activity.
Okay, so the best way to reach you would be through Google Plus, or can I email you?
I'd go through Google Plus. That's
okay. No, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I do appreciate that.
Sure. The other thing to keep in mind is when you submit spam reports or reports like this, and you also have a site in that niche, usually your time is better spent to focus more on your site to get that up to speed than to focus on competitors that might be doing some weird things too. I think it's useful to let us know about these things, but I wouldn't focus on them too much afterwards, because now we have this information. We can try to see what we can do with that, but it's not guaranteed that we'll say, oh, these guys are doing weird stuff, we're going to remove them completely from the index, and everyone else will pop up 3 or 4 or 5 places. So you still need to focus on your site and make sure that it's really the best it can be in that area, assuming you have a site in there. I don't know. Maybe this is just something you ran across. But these kinds of reports are really useful for us, because sometimes these are issues that the teams know about already, but sometimes these are also issues that they weren't aware of being this visible, perhaps. So by all means, keep these kind of things coming.
Okay, no, fantastic. I'll shoot you a note with some of these details, and then absolutely, I mean, we leave it into your hands, and I appreciate it. I appreciate it, John.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, let me run through some of the submitted questions, and then we can get back to more discussions here in the Hangout. Is the overall site-wide quality score computed from individual pages? Is Google ranking specific pages, so site-wide score must be based on this? Am I right? I think there's probably a misunderstanding that there's this one site-wide number that Google keeps for all websites, and that's not the case. We look at lots of different factors, and there's not just this one site-wide quality score that we look at. So we try to look at a variety of different signals that come together. Some of them are per page, some of them are more per site, but it's not the case that there's like one number and it comes from these 5 pages on your website. How best should you mark up an address on a page? Should you put it in normal content, or would you put it between H tags or anything else to enforce the location element to Google? From my point of view, I would use, I believe, the local business schema.org markup, which you can use on your pages, and you can just use that as normal markup on your pages. You don't need to kind of put your address in heading or put it in a bigger font or anything like that. We'll try to figure out that this is an address, that this belongs to your site, and treat that appropriately. So no need to kind of make it bold or put it in headings or anything like that. Are links to our images in any way related to links which would impact the text search results? We've seen a lot of links to our images from poor image-based foreign sites. Are they harmless, or should we disavow? So first of all, just because it's a foreign site doesn't mean that it's a bad site. Sometimes we see sites that are linking across languages, where maybe some Japanese or Chinese forum thinks this is really funny or really interesting, and they start linking to a site. But just because it's a foreign site doesn't mean that it's bad. So don't disavow all links from foreign sites by default. There's lots of good content out there on the web, lots of people who are writing stuff, and sometimes they might link to your site too. So don't kind of focus on the foreign aspect. With regards to links to images, I assume that these are basically images embedded on the other site. I wouldn't worry about that. That's not something where I'd say that would go into the web spam calculation there. We try to use that for image search a bit to understand which of these images belong where, but that's not something where you'd need to disavow those embedded images through the disavow links tool. I don't think the disavow links tool would even affect how images are embedded or how we treat the image embedding, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I've seen some sites who regularly change their site-wide footer anchor text to keep it fresh. Would you say this is a good or bad practice? I'd say keep it correct, the footers and the headings and stuff you have on your site, but there's no need to artificially update your template just to make it look like pages on your site have changed. We do use the change or the perceived kind of change frequency to help us figure out when we need to crawl, but crawling doesn't mean ranking. So just because we crawl a lot of content from your site doesn't mean that we'll show it higher in rankings. So that's something where by artificially changing your template and making all of your pages change regularly, you're essentially just putting a load on your server. You're not getting anything back for that. I'm serving A/B tests to big proportion of traffic using Adobe software. If these tests are served to a selection of user agents but not Googlebot, is that considered cloaking, and could it risk a penalty? What's the recommendation duration for an A/B test? So from our point of view, you should treat Googlebot like you would any other user. So if you're doing A/B testing, then Googlebot probably needs to fall into one of those A or B or however many variations you're testing slots as well. The other thing to keep in mind is you need to kind of treat Googlebot like other users in that location. So if you treat users in a different way, if you do an A/B test specifically for users in the US and Googlebot crawls from the US for your site, then you'd need to kind of include Googlebot in that A/B test run. On the other hand, if you're doing an A/B test for users in France, for example, and Googlebot is crawling from the US and everyone from the US sees the same version, then that's nothing where you'd need to do anything special for. With regards to the duration, we just recommend to kind of keep it reasonable in the sense that you shouldn't be doing an A/B test for an extended period of time where you could say, well, it's not an A/B test anymore. It's essentially the stable state for this site. So that's something where we don't have any fixed time, but kind of need to look at it on your side. Some sites do regular A/B testing in that they go A/B and they test it for a month and then they test other variations and next variations and they continually test, and that's fine too. It's just we don't want a situation where you're doing different content than what Googlebot would be seeing. How often do human quality raters look at websites for EAT qualities that can strongly influence rankings? Are they triggered to review the content if changes are made to the site? So one thing to kind of keep in mind here with regards to the quality raters that we have is their primary objective is to test our algorithm updates, to test kind of the things that we think might make sense to test. They're not going to review your website and say, oh, this site should be ranking like this site should be ranking like this. So they're not a human aspect to the rankings. They're more an aspect to kind of double check that our experiments, our ideas make sense or don't make sense. So with that in mind, it's not that someone is going to manually visit your website and say, oh, this score is 5 out of 10, and tomorrow it'll be taken into account in rankings. That definitely doesn't happen. Our systems are completely automated. We need to be able to handle the bulk of the web, and we can't manually look at all web pages and kind of figure out how they should be ranking. That wouldn't really make sense. I have 2 questions regarding anchor text and articles. If you have 2 different anchor texts going to the same URL, is that a problem? No. Is it a problem if a couple of articles use the same anchor text going to the same place, or should you always use a different anchor text? No, that's also not a problem. So link naturally. Make sure that your site's navigation internally works well for users. Sometimes that means you need to kind of adjust the anchor text depending on the context. Sometimes that means you just use the same anchor text for everything. I mean, not for everything, but for every place where you link to that page. So for example, the home page usually is linked with like a text called home, and that's not something where you need to vary the anchor text. If you wanted to rank for a phrase, you used to be able to have content with those keyword phrases in it, and that would be sufficient. Now it's very confusing what Google actually wants to have, and the info out there contradicts. Any tips? I don't know. Make a great website is one tip, which people don't really like to hear because they like to focus on like individual lines of HTML that you can tweak. But we've been using lots and lots of factors for ranking for a really long time. I think the over 200 factors comment that we have, that's been in place since I've been at Google, which is, I don't know, 8 years or so. So it's definitely not the case that we only look at words on a page and say this is how we should rank a site. essentially, even if you go back to the beginning of Google, we looked into links, for example, a lot to try to figure out how we should rank things, and that's also a factor. So it was never really the case that just by putting some words on a page, you would automatically rank for those words. So you really need to take a step back, look at your website overall, make sure that what you're providing is really the absolute best of its kind out there. With regards to the words on the page, they kind of have to be there too. We can't make up words for your site to rank for. We need to be able to pick up that content somewhere on your site too. And just with regards to kind of everything around it, what you're doing there, so that when people go to your site, they recognize that this is really the most awesome site for that topic, and that they go off and recommend it to their friends, that they maybe link to it, all of that. So with that in mind, all of these factors kind of bubble down to really making an awesome website. You said in the last Hangout, if you change your internal link structure, then the algorithm needs a medium amount of time before it trusts the new setup, and then the rankings will settle down. How long is that? We don't have any fixed amount of time for a change like that. So that's something that, on the one hand, depends a bit on your website, how often we crawl pages from your website. On the other hand, it depends a bit on the structure that you have, the changes that you've made. Essentially, if you change all of the URLs on your website, which kind of goes into changing the internal link structure, then we need to figure out how the old signals that we have for individual pages, which give us some idea of the context of these pages, the text on these pages, how they apply to the new pages that you have on your website. And that's something that sometimes takes a bit of time to kind of forward those signals to the right pages, recognize the redirects, recognize the new linking structure within the website. If I had to give some vague idea of a time, I'd say you're probably looking into multiple weeks, probably even multiple months for that to really settle down properly. So this is one of the reasons why I tend to tell people not to make these kind of changes on a whim. If you want to change the internal structure of your website, be it all of the URLs, the URL structure, or the internal linking structure of your website, make sure that it's really something that you want to keep for the long term. So don't just say, oh, I'm going to remove that PHP from all of my URLs, and then a month later say, oh, I'm going to add HTML to make it look like they're actually static HTML pages a month later, because then you're constantly in the situation of Google having to figure everything out again. So try to find a structure that works for your site and one that you can kind of expand on, that you can build on for the long run. When you say we have to trust that it's just not going to change, does that mean we need to be careful about making changes to web pages too often? So I'm not completely sure with regards to what you mean we have to trust that it's just not going to change. So I'm not quite sure what you're hinting at there. In general, making changes on web pages when you think that there's something that needs to be changed is perfectly fine. There's no reason to kind of hold back on making changes on a website. Sometimes when you're in a situation, for example, where maybe you had a manual penalty, or from I don't know, some algorithms, when they're looking at your site and they recognize something problematic, then those are in the type of situations where we think, well, it probably makes sense to kind of double check that this really resolved before we actually clean that up. But for the most part, making changes is a normal part of the web, and that's not something I'd want to hold anyone back from doing. We can't fit all the categories and links we want on the homepage, so we thought about adding a scrollable bar with a few of these categories off-page until the user selects to move across to access them. Is that bad from an SEO point of view? Not necessarily. We probably still recognize those links, and we can still crawl the internal linking structure of a site like that. I think you probably just want to make sure that the context of all of your pages is still clear, and you probably see a bigger impact from the usability side of like how users are engaging with your website, what they're doing on your site. Are they actually finding the products they want to buy on your website, or are they getting stuck in the menu somewhere? So I'd look at that more as something from a usability point of view than from an SEO point of view. The only thing I can think about from an SEO point of view, which you might want to watch out for, is if you're dynamically loading those links based on like the user behavior and people like scrolling down there, and then you use JavaScript events to trigger loading these links to your additional categories, then that's something that we probably wouldn't be able to pick up on, because Googlebot doesn't hover over the page to see what kind of JavaScript triggers and what kind of new links might be embedded on the page. We expect pretty much the content to be on the page when we render it. If it's in a menu that is kind of a drop-down menu and it's loaded on the page but it's just not visible, that's still fine. Should you have an HTML sitemap as well as an XML sitemap? Is there any advantage to having both? You can do both. So it kind of depends on your site. On the one hand, an HTML sitemap can be useful for usability reasons. Sometimes people rely too much on an HTML sitemap to kind of usability issues on a website. So if the normal navigation doesn't lead people to the content, then I wouldn't rely on HTML sitemap to kind of guide people there, because probably they'll just jump off and say, I can't deal with this website, this is too complicated. So that's something you should probably keep in mind and probably test. Are users really looking at your HTML sitemap, or is this essentially something that you're maintaining for a handful of people and nobody else actually uses it? That's more from a usability point to kind of keep in mind. For XML sitemaps, that's something that we definitely use on our side. And there specifically, we're looking at things like the URL. So if we find new URLs in there, and the last modification date, so that we understand when existing URLs were changed. So those are essentially the most relevant parts of the sitemap there. Depending on your website, you could also just use an RSS feed or an Atom feed as well. So it's not that you need to have an XML sitemap, but some kind of a way to let us know this URL exists and this other URL recently changed. That's really useful. My client is going to launch his French-Canadian site under a two-level subdomain, fr.ca.tld.com. Will it still be possible to add the site to Search Console and enable geo-targeting? Will other HTML markup work properly? Yes and yes. So for both of those, you should be able to add geo-targeting. You wouldn't be able to add geo-targeting if the TLD was a country code top-level domain. So if it's like CA, if you had, for example, a site hosted on a CA TLD where you want to target users in the US or where you want to target users in India, then you wouldn't be able to use geo-targeting because the CA essentially override that setting. I think you can't even set that setting in a case like that. Other HTML markup like hreflang, you can definitely use that. That works even if you can't set geo-targeting. What if I embed an audio file in my content? Can you see how long the audio file is and reduce the quality of that page if it's too long and users don't listen to it? Unfortunately, we pretty much ignore audio files for web search. So we don't know what you have in your audio files. We don't know what kind of content you have in there. And if it's a really fantastic audio file, maybe a podcast or something, then we can't tell from the audio file alone. We try to figure that out through the context, so the HTML page where you're embedding it, but we don't actually see what's in the audio file itself. So that's something. Maybe that gives you some ideas of what you could do. If, for example, if you have a lot of audio files on your website, if you have a podcast that you're doing regularly, then that's something that essentially we focus on the content that's visible on the page. So, for example, if you had a podcast where you discuss cool topics that you think are interesting to people, then I'd make sure that you put some of that information into the HTML page as well. Maybe at least the title of like topic, what you're talking about, the people who are there. In some cases, maybe even a transcript of part of the page. How many cycles of slow-running Panda are we looking at per year? 6 or 4 or 5 or 3 or 12? I know that Panda is on continuous run. I don't know. It kind of just runs on its own. So I don't have any metric that we can kind of hand out there. Is parallax scrolling bad for SEO? How does Google handle it? Is it like hidden tabbed content? What would you recommend? So I think parallax scrolling is when you scroll and it kind of does something special instead of just the normal scrolling. From our point of view, that's perfectly fine. That's something that you can use to kind of make your content visible like that. Sometimes there might be usability issues around that, but that's more between you and your users. With regards to the content itself, the important part is really that when we render the page, that all of this content is kind of loaded on the page, so that it's not the case that you kind of lazy load the content itself based on the scroll position, for example. Because if you load the content using JavaScript later on, when the user is kind of scrolling on the page, then we wouldn't see that. We wouldn't be able to index that content.
John, sorry.
Yes.
Just with regard to that question.
Okay.
So I found some Parallax sites have their menus where it's almost like anchors. So when you click on it, it creates your normal domain, then hash, and then the rest of the menu item. Are you able to crawl after the
hash? Sometimes. So if the content is actually on the page, then we can find that there. But if you're using these hash anchors and using JavaScript to load content based on those anchors, then we wouldn't be able to see that. The hash bang format, so the hash and the exclamation mark, that's something that you could use, but if you use that, you need to make sure that you have the escaped fragment version of that URL with the full content already pre-rendered. So my recommendation there would be to use something like the HTML5 history API, where you can change the full URL and provide a normal kind of static-looking URL for that content, so that we can go there, we recognize there's JavaScript on there, we can render the page with the JavaScript and the content that's pulled in, and we can index it like that. If it's just a hash, then we'll index the main part of the URL instead. We'll skip everything after the hash, for the most part. There are some few exceptions where we recognize that this works, but you don't want to rely on Googlebot recognizing that your site is kind of weird. You really want to make sure that you're providing content in a way that's easy for Googlebot to digest and understand.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, another Panda question. If Panda is continuously updating, if I request Google to recrawl the domain using Search Console, does that mean that the Panda algorithm will reevaluate it sooner than if I had not taken this action? So you can't really request a recrawl of your whole domain using Search Console. You can submit individual URLs and say, well, this content has changed, please update that. Or individual URLs using the Submit to Index tool, but you can't do that for your whole domain. There's also a limit on the number of pages there. So that's kind of like, it's not really possible to submit your whole domain to be recrawled anyway, but a lot of these processes run in parallel anyway. So the Panda algorithm will run at its cycle, and the recrawling of individual pages happens in its own cycle. Some pages get crawled faster, some pages get crawled slower. All of that kind of happens in parallel, so it's not the case that pushing one URL a little bit faster to the index will result in the other thing that's running in parallel updating that any faster. What's the best alternative to alt text for SVG files and inline SVGs? How does Google treat the title in SVG images? This is really an interesting question. I received a few other emails recently about SVG files, so I need to figure out a way to kind of compile all of this information and make it useful and accessible for all of you as well. In general, if there's text in an inline SVG, so in an SVG image, I don't know, is it even an image? Would you call it an image? If you have an SVG inlined in an HTML page, then that's something we would pick up as text for that HTML page as well. So if you have maybe a complicated infographic and you have that all inline in an SVG, then that might look like you have all of these different words on your page as well when we render that page. So you'll see that in the snippet when you search for part of that text. You might see that in the cached page view as well. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. If you're inlining SVGs, then the text in there will be seen as a part of the page as well. On the other hand, if you're embedding SVG files, then we don't look at the text so much. We treat those SVG files more like images, and we pick them up and try to show them in image search. So that's kind of the difference there. On the one hand, the inlined SVGs we try to treat as part of the content on the page, and the embedded SVG files, so if you're referring to an SVG file, we treat more like images, which we would pick up for image search. With regards to alt attributes or titles, that's something where when we have an embedded SVG file, we try to pick up the context. So we try to figure out what text is surrounding this SVG image, which could be something like a caption below, a title of a section, text on that page, all of that. Making a website for kids, are there any settings we should take care of other than the child-directed treatment setting? The child-directed treatment setting is really a good thing to do. That is propagated to, I believe, the ads and the analytics side as well. So that's something to kind of keep in mind there. I'm not aware of anything else that you'd need to kind of add to your pages for kids' websites. Does Google blacklist websites that are known to commit extortion? We have an employee who was falsely listed on a known extortion site. They won't remove him, and his profile is showing on both Google search and image search. In general, we don't step in those kind of situations. That's more something where if there's a legal aspect involved, then that's something you'd need to handle on your side, maybe with a lawyer to figure out what you could do there. In general, we try to kind of pick up the web and be more like a mirror of the web than to make judgment calls on the type of content that we show there. There's some exceptions there, and I know there's some teams trying to figure out ways to make sure that the content which we show in things like image search is really relevant, but it's not the case that we would like take this as a web spam report and the web spam team would say, oh, this is a shady site, we'll just remove it from search because we don't really like what it's doing. So either there's a legal basis for something and then you could interact directly with them, or maybe there is a web spam aspect there where we could like pass that on to the web spam team and say they're doing this web spam tactic. That's an aspect to do. Or maybe there are other things that you could just do to make sure that the more legitimate content is also available for that specific name. We use a branded bit.ly link for a social media post and recently became aware that this domain that bit.ly owns and we can't submit a ticket for is listed as malware. Can someone help us rectify this issue as we can't use Webmaster Tools or Search Console, I guess? There are two things maybe you could do. On the one hand, if you have access to DNS, you can do DNS verification in Search Console. That might be one option. On the other hand, there's stopbadware.org, which is a third-party site where you can also submit your domain to be reviewed specifically for malware. So if you can't verify your site in no way possible, then you can use stopbadware.org to submit a review request, which is sent to our systems, which we review there too. I migrated my site from HTTP to HTTPS. For a keyword, HTTPS page link is showing in search results, and for other keywords, HTTPS pages are shown only on mouse over. What would be the issue on my site? Crawling frequency also went down. So crawling frequency wouldn't be related to this. That would be something probably completely different. One thing I have seen, which is kind of confusing, I think, is if we're showing breadcrumbs for your URLs, then we don't show the HTTP part. Or maybe this is just in some cases, but where we show breadcrumbs and kind of like the line with the URL gets too long, then we just don't show the HTTPS part. It's still linked as HTTPS, so if you hover over it, like you mentioned, you'll still be linked to the HTTPS page. We just don't show it in the URL in the visible part. So that's something which sometimes is a bit confusing, especially when you're looking at this. In practice, we recognize the HTTPS. We link to it properly. We're using structured data markup for product pages, but we have product questions also on the same page, so we use structured data for questions. Will this confuse Google in recognizing the page type? No. Usually, that's perfectly fine. Lots of people include different types of structured data on the same page, and that should just work. Recently had a manual penalty revoked 1 week ago for links, but the penalty is still reported in Search Console. Is that normal? Should I submit another reconsideration request? Sometimes you'll see kind of I guess a lag or delay of maybe a day or so in the manual action settings until the settings have actually propagated. But if you're saying that was a week ago, that sounds like something either got stuck or didn't really happen properly. So you could submit another reconsideration request. You could maybe post in the forum so that someone from the WebStem team can double check what was actually happening there. Both of those would be reasonable. Shouldn't be any problem either way. Do you Google use no-followed links for URL discovery? In other words, if there is one no-followed link pointing to URL and there aren't any other hints to discover the URL on the web, will it be crawled and indexed? Usually not, but it's really rare for there just to be one reference to a specific URL. So I wouldn't rely on no-followed links blocking crawling. If you need to block crawling, then do that distinctly, specifically with the robots text. If you don't need to block crawling, then maybe we'll crawl it, maybe we won't crawl it, maybe we'll find another copy of a page somewhere that doesn't have a no-followed link. Those are essentially the options. So it's not that I would say we never crawl it or we never look at that URL, because the web is big and we see lots of references to most URLs. I'd like to ask if it's possible to delete personal information that persists on one of the websites I visited and logged on. I saw my personal information in search and want to delete it. I can't even log into said website anymore. So what I would do there is go to the Webmaster Help Forum and kind of let people know there, and usually they can guide you into the steps that you could take to kind of remove that from search or to help get in touch with the webmaster there so that you can have that removed. When you do post in the Webmaster Help Forum, for a case like this where maybe your name is one of the problems there, I'd make sure not to put your name in clear text in the posting, because otherwise suddenly that posting will rank for your name too. So maybe use a URL shortener pointing at the search result where you see this problem, maybe a URL shortener for the page where you think the problem still persists. And the people in the forum are really good at kind of respecting your URL shortener and making sure that your name doesn't suddenly show up in the thread too. When monitoring links to maintain your disavow file, is Webmaster Tools enough, or should we be paying for third-party link monitoring services? So on the one hand, I would not use Webmaster Tools because that doesn't exist anymore. You should use Search Console. That's much better. On the other hand, for the most part, you don't need to monitor your third-party links because we're pretty good at kind of handling the normal churn on the web, and you don't need to really manually keep track of every single link that's coming to your website. The final point is we do primarily focus on the link shown in search results. However, sometimes third-party kind of link tools make it easier for you to spot things that you might not notice in Search Console Direct. So it's not so much that there's more data in other tools. Sometimes there's slightly different data, but sometimes these tools are more fine-tuned towards recognizing certain kinds of problematic links that make it easier for you to figure out what you could be submitting in a disavow file. Again, I just don't want you to kind of panic and run off and use all kinds of tools to figure out every link that's pointing to your site, which might be problematic. For the most part, we just get this right. But if you do run across bigger issues with links to your site, then putting that in a disavow file is a great way to get kind of a peace of mind. Does page age influence ranking? If so, how is it determined? If I update an old page today and change the creation date in WordPress today, would it impact its ranking negatively? We do sometimes look at the age of a page to kind of figure out what kind of page this is. Is this like evergreen content or not? But for the most part, the age is more something that's indirectly reflected, where we see lots of people have been referring to this page. They've been linking to this page for years and years now. So we can kind of tell, well, this is probably a pretty good page on this topic. If you change those pages, if you change things on those pages, that's something that's perfectly fine. That's normal part of the web. Sometimes boilerplate gets changed, the copyright date gets changed, all of that changes, and we still need to be able to kind of figure out, well, the current date says this on this page, but actually we think this is something that we've known for a really long time, and we have a lot of really good signals for this over the years, so we'll just kind of figure out which date we want to use there. If you search for I guess this company's name and a Dutch term, I think like phone number or something like that. In Google, a large phone number pops up in the search result, not the same for our competitors. While calling us is good for a select few, we don't really want people to call us. Paraphrase slightly. How do we remove this phone number? You can't remove the phone number directly, but you can use the markup on your pages to specify a phone number. So if there's a customer service number that you think would be okay, then you can definitely specify that on your pages, and we'll reflect that in search, essentially. Earlier, you recommended escape fragments for JavaScript pages, but this was deprecated in October last year. For heavily JavaScript-based websites, should we still look into implementing escape fragment URLs? So I would not recommend using it for the long run. I think if you need to tide things over because your website is otherwise breaking and not accessible at all in search, then that might be an option, but especially if you're setting up a new site, I'd really recommend using the history API and normal-looking URLs instead. Any updates on where AMP will be expanding to next? I think we already have Canada, so you should be okay, Jennifer. So I don't have any details on which other countries we have planned next. In the AMP Hangout we did a couple days ago, some of the folks from the AMP team talked a bit about how we pick new countries, and in general it's mostly on where we see countries being ready. So if you're located in one country and you see AMP isn't visible there yet, then I wouldn't wait with setting up the AMP markup, because essentially we try to see how much AMP markup there is really available in that country, and if we see that there's enough, if we see that we have enough content to create this carousel, then we'll enable that. So if you're in a country where it's not available yet, don't let that hold you back from implementing AMP. All right, more questions from you all. Wow, we made it through all the questions this time.
Hi, here's Colin. I've been in a chat before earlier this week, and I posted actually a question into the thread, but not now in the Q&A because I wasn't sure if you would make it. So here's my question. It's a bit tricky situation. We got like 5,000 activity. First of all, we are an online shop for gifts. We sell gifts online, and we have like 5,000 activities in Germany in our assortment, which might be something like drive a Ferrari in Munich, drive a Ferrari in Hamburg, or elsewhere. And we have for every city actually an own landing page, because we consider it as a different product. However, in order to make it possible for our content team to create all those pages, we do have the same text. So what happened is that we then started to only make some pages indexable, like Ferrari driving Berlin, and Ferrari driving Munich will be not on index because it's the same content from the description. However, we kind of miss a lot of possibility to then also rank if someone is looking for driving Ferrari in Munich, because we do have something for that. And so right now, it has been going on for some time. I didn't see it, and now I figured out it's like 1,200 pages. We have no index, and I'm not sure what to do here. Should we put it live? Should we keep it like that? Yeah.
There's no absolute answer for you. Sorry. So in general, my recommendation is if the page can stand on its own, then that's perfectly fine. If the page is essentially just a variation of something else that kind of exists, then maybe combining those pages into one page, using rel canonical to let us know that these are essentially equivalent pages, those would be some things that you could do there.
Yeah.
So when you have something like Ferrari driving that you would do in every city in Germany, that's something where maybe it makes sense to split that out into regions, maybe, and just say, well, in this region we have Ferrari driving, and that's available in these cities at these times, for example, to kind of say, well, that's kind of like a shoe model that I have in my shoe store, and these are the different sizes or the color options.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, we made that decision already some time ago. So, and it's too much content to deal with and to just plug it together. So we have to deal now that we do have kind of. It's actually a good way of just saying we have the same trouser and you have it in SML, you know, and kind of made the mistake then probably to just create separate pages for this. And a canonical doesn't feel right as well, right? Because you wouldn't want to set a canonical from T-shirt S to XL because it's not. It's kind of somehow a different product.
Yeah.
So I just wonder, is there if we put those in index, is there like how should we produce? How should we do it? Should we should start continually just putting those in index and see what happens? I mean, we do have a lot of pages, right? It's only 1,000, and I think our shop has more than, I don't know, 20,000 pages. So it's like some percent. What would you suggest?
I mean, if you want to make all of these indexable, then I don't see any problem with like putting 1,000 or 10,000 or even 100,000 pages suddenly on index. That's something where it's more of a technical problem on our side to crawl and index these pages than any kind of a quality issue on your side. So
yeah, well, Bashai, I don't know if the robot is or another question. Is it a bad sign for the robot if on the page, on the same domain, it finds the same content pieces on different pages? Because that's essentially what's happening, right? Because the pages look very similar, there's only few words different.
Yeah. I was actually in a duplicate content session last night, so there's a hangout from, I forgot who set it up. Really bad with names, on duplicate content that we did last night, which covers a lot of that. That might be interesting for you.
Okay.
In general, we recognize that these pages are unique because they're not one-to-one copies, and we recognize that the block of text is essentially the same across different pages.
Okay.
So we will index all of these pages, and when it comes to searching, if someone is searching for something that's in this block of text, then we'll pick one of them because we don't know which one is the best one. But when someone is searching for something that's unique to a specific page, okay, well, Ferrari driving is shared across all of these pages, but Munich is unique to this one, so we'll take that one.
Okay.
So from my point of view, it's not so much a quality issue that we would say this is a problem with regards to your website quality, but more a usability issue, like is this really something users would find? And also an issue with kind of the weight that you give these pages.
Okay.
If you spread out Ferrari driving across 100,000 cities in Germany because you do it everywhere, then all of those pages will have really small value because you kind of diluting the value that you have for Ferrari driving in Germany across everything here.
Yeah,
So,
therefore we do have the category page.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
I mean,
that
category
should
page
be the one that's going to
is
rank
kind
for.
of good. Yeah. Yeah, so having something like a category page is good, but also if you have a category page, then you could think about theoretically saying, well, all the rel canonicals go to the category page about Ferrari driving in Germany, so that this is a really strong page, and from there people can still go to their individual city, or the category page lists all the cities as well. Might be an option too. I think that the current setup you have without looking at your website with a no index is probably suboptimal because we still have to crawl those pages. We still have to figure out what is actually on these pages. We have to recognize the no index. And then what happens there is if someone links to one of these pages, like Ferrari driving in some random city in Germany, then that value of that link essentially disappears because it goes to a no index page. There's nothing we can really do with that. So Canonical would forward that at least to the category page. If you had it indexed, then at least we could recognize, well, this is kind of the same as other pages. We'll kind of spread that out a little bit maybe. But by blocking it with robots text or putting a no index on a page that's kind of a duplicate, you're not doing your site any good with regards to handling of the duplicate content.
Okay. Okay, great. So, and also what I essentially understood is that you would say, just put them all in one batch on index then and see what happens, basically.
Yeah, so personally, I wouldn't do everything at once and just see what happens because that's sometimes a recipe for disaster. If something goes wrong, then you're like, oh, no, shit, I have to fix everything again. I would do a test. So
Gradually.
take maybe one topic and say, for this topic, I'll put these pages in, and monitor how Google reacts to that, how they rank, but also monitor how users react to that. So do they go onto these pages? Do they search for these pages? Or do they convert when they go to these pages?
It's very niche-y. There's hardly to see anything on it. But okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. But thanks a lot for the feedback on this, and I'll maybe also check the thread from yesterday then.
Okay, great.
Great.
All right. One last question from anyone. We're kind of running out of time, but...
John, could I ask a question if that's all right?
Sure.
At the end of Tuesday's Hangout, I think I asked the question about if you have a page that isn't in Google's index but contains links to your site. I think you said, I could be wrong, but I think you said a couple of years ago that that page would not be considered, or wouldn't impact an algorithm that might be looking negatively at your site. And then I also mentioned last time, even if that page is listed in Search Console, and you said, whoa, hang on a minute, there shouldn't be pages listed in Search Console. I mean, there's a lag on Search Console, I think, sometimes, but you shouldn't see a page listed in Search Console that isn't in the index. And I sent you a few examples. I don't know if you had a look at that.
I haven't had a chance to kind of dig into the numbers there, or the URL specifically, but I saw that, yeah.
Okay. I mean, it was more, just very quickly, it was more there are three types. I mean, there's always going to be an example. If someone, for example, did a page that was set as no index follow, then that will presumably not be in Google's index, but the links will be added to the link graph. So that's one example. And then there might...
Yeah. That's case because when it has a no index on it, we generally try to keep it in our index and follow those links, but it's not the case that that's guaranteed. So it might be that we say, well, it's always been a no index. Why do we even bother with this URL? We can just like drop it completely. So that's, let's say, it's complicated type of situation.
Okay, but it's more about the impact. That's one type. The other type is when the page is marked to be indexed, but I think Google sometimes makes a decision not to show it in search results, like if it's particularly spammy or something. That kind of happens. And then there's the other example, I think, that people see where a page genuinely completely disappears, but it still shows in Search Console for a while, but it seems to be taken out of the index. And the question wasn't so much is there a lag on Search Console or what the reason is, because I mean that's kind of by the by. It's more in each of those three cases, how does the algorithm treat those sorts of pages? Are they counted positively or negatively, or are they just completely ignored?
Most likely, we'll end up ignoring them. So we try to put weights on a lot of this stuff to see how important these aspects are. And if this is something that's such an edge case, it's like, well, we're barely picking it up and showing it somewhere, then chances are it just has a really low weight, and we focus on the other things.
Okay, so in other words, if it doesn't appear to be an index, as in if you search the URL or you search for part of the page and it doesn't come up, but you still see it in Search Console for some of the reasons that we've just discussed, then either it will have no weight at all, or it might just have a very small amount of weight in terms of the link value that's passed across.
Yeah.
So we still need to kind of worry isn't the right word, because one example that I sent you was actually a really positive link. We had a fantastic set of links from someone that did a TV station that did a great feature on us, and they removed it because the series had finished, not in the index, showing in Search Console. So that's kind of looking at things the other way around. Well, hang on, are we still getting positive benefit from these pages that aren't actually there anymore?
Yeah. So probably when we start to reprocess all of that, it'll disappear.
Right. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, that happens.
Okay.
But I'll take a look at the examples that you sent and see if there's anything we need to do with the Search Console team to figure out like what we can do to keep this stuff a little bit fresher or a little bit easier to understand.
Thanks. Just because, again, I think that people obviously, as the question, there's a couple of questions before, people do look very strongly towards Search Console to understand what they should and shouldn't do with their links and the impact they're having. And so, you know, if I find that pages that are no indexed take a lot longer to drop out of Search Console than pages that are indexed follow. I don't know if that's because crawling, Google won't invest as much crawling time in a page that's originally marked as no index. I don't really know, but that's one example of a page that I sent you.
Okay, I'll take a look at that.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks a lot for all of your feedback so far and the questions that came. I think there are no more planned, but I'll be setting up the next ones so that you have room to add more questions for the next rounds. I hope you had a great week, and I wish you all a great weekend. Bye, everyone.
Cheers, John.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.